Prologue. 1 month ago. Caesar paced back and forth in his spaciously well-decorated living room. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. He had woken up this morning to Tom, his private investigator, telling him he had a lead and was going to check it out. It was all by God's grace that he hadn't had a heart attack. He's been married to Beatrice for over 2 years. 8 months after they got married, she disappeared into thin air. She had been behaving weird just a few days before she had vanished, and no one knows where she is. Beatrice, he thought, the lovely girl he met at the charity gala just months before they were forced together. Well, she was forced to marry him. It was a necessity for him, seeing as it would have made Palmer, Beatrice's father, a man he wanted to go into business with, pleased. She was very sweet the few times they had met, and when they started dating, her true nature began to show. She was temperamental, quick to judge, always jumping to conclusions, and many other things that pissed him off. He could see all the warning signs not to get married to her flashing in neon lights, but he ignored every single one of them. After they got married, things only got worse for him, because then she figured she owned him. He began to stay the night in the office, which only made things worse because she thought he was cheating on her. That was when the weirdness began. She became oddly quiet and only talked when he asked her a question, which he seldom did. Caesar combed his fingers through his hair and sighed heavily. That's why he hired Tom, who had been on the case for over a year. His thoughts went back to the day he last saw her, remembering the last thing she said to him before she walked out of their house. She lied straight to his face, saying she was going to stay with her mum for a while. He had offered to give her a ride, but she declined, saying she would have a few stops on the way. Even though he knew the latter part was just an excuse, it was typical of B. She always did things her way, not caring about the repercussions, and no one could stop her. So, he let her leave. No questions asked. That same day after he got home, he called B's mum, Mary, who said she hadn't seen B since she had visited 2 weeks ago. Just then Caesar's phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts and making him stop in his track. Yay? He answered the call. I found her, Mr. Thompson, and she doesn't look too good. Tom said. He sighed in relief, a frown on his tired-looking stubble-covered face. Bring her home, Tom. He ended the call and fell into one of the sofas, his head falling backwards. Somewhere in the same city, Jules struggled with the door as she tried to keep the groceries from falling to the ground. She finally got the door unlocked and nudged the door wide open. Entering her 600-square-foot house, she kicked the door shut behind her, walking briskly but carefully through the medium-sized, all-white parlor into the kitchen. She dumped everything on the kitchen counter, then began sorting them out. Today's the day. She thought as a smile made its way to her lips. She was excited and nervous at the same time. Today's the day she gets to know the verdict. The odds seemed to be in her favor, but she couldn't be sure. Since Jules' parents died almost 2 years ago, she had tried to drown herself and worked to prevent herself from breaking down, until she realized it wasn't right, and her parents wouldn't want that for her. They would want her to be happy. A few months after losing them, she knew it was time to go along with her old plans. She has always loved children, and somewhere between babysitting for neighbors and family friends in her teens through to college, she decided she was going to adopt a child when she was ready. She made sure she wasn't making her decision because she was grieving, because it wouldn't be fair to the child. It had taken her a few months to realize that even if her parents were alive, she would have chosen that time to adopt. Since her first and last relationship of 2 years in college ended tragically, which put her permanently in the single ladies section of the population, it had taken her a while to get over catching her boyfriend, at that time, cheating on her with her roommate. In her bed. On her birthday. Yeah. TAADAA. Happy birthday, Jules. She swore off men since then. They just brought havoc into her peaceful life. Relationships are complications. Been there, done that. Her phone rang. She placed the carton of milk which was in her hand on the counter as she checked the caller's ID. Oh, please, not again. Hello? Jules picked up the call. Jules. It was her lawyer, Bethany. Please tell me it's not getting dragged out again? Jules skipped right to it. A year after her parents died, she had gotten information about a child that was up for adoption. By then, she had gone up the waiting list and had been lucky to have been selected for the perfect 2-month-old baby girl. After the adoption service had gone through all the mandatory procedures to have her checked out on all fronts. Now, 9 months later, the adoption process was dragged out, and it was one thing after another. She had needed her lawyer at one time. But during all that, she started to baby-proof the house. buying a baby cot and many other things just in case it came through. It all came down to this. Bethany had been helpful through it all. The closed adoption was easier than they both expected because the mother of the child had given her up willingly and the father was not mentioned. Bethany took care of all those things alongside her, even though Bethany had offered to do it all and contact her when she was needed. Jules had politely declined her offer because she wanted to have all hands on deck. Bethany scoffed, "It's over. You're now a mother." The smile in Bethany's voice wasn't hard to miss. Jules grinned from ear to ear, her heart bubbling with joy, as she sighed in relief. "What now?" "Now you're going to need to replace your convertible." Jules didn't even care about that, happily. This was it. She was finally going to be a mother. It felt like Christmas. Chapter 1 Part 2. Jules rode the elevator up with Ivy in her arms. The only reason she liked work less was that she had to leave Ivy at the daycare on the second floor of the company's building. She wanted Ivy to be with her all the time but knew it wasn't going to happen. The elevator dinged open and she got out, walking into the lobby of the daycare. "Hey, you." Sophie beamed from behind the desk as she saw Jules approaching her. "Hey. Where's Andy?" Jules asked Sophie, looking around for her other best friend. "With the other kids, inside. I don't know how she never gets tired of their screams," she answered, getting up and going around the desk towards Jules. "Hey, cutie." She smiled down at Ivy in Jules' arm. Jules smiled at the look on Ivy's face. It was the same one that she had when she saw Sophie and Andy. She was looking at Sophie with a stoic look, blinking frequently like one of those episodes of Tom and Jerry where they go blink, blink, blink. Sophie's expression changed to a "she's so adorable" look as she reached for Ivy and adjusted her in her arms. Ivy's expression changed in seconds as Sophie began speaking baby language to Ivy, which was nothing but complete gibberish. But if it made Ivy smile, then who was she to stop the discussion? Jules left Ivy with Sophie, going inside the daycare in search of Andy. Jules, Miranda and Sophia have been friends since Jules joined Freddie and Company 5 years ago. They had hit it off immediately and have been friends ever since. They knew about the adoption and everything else, just like she knew about Sophia's family problems and Miranda's relationship issues. They were the ones who resurfaced her dream of adopting and promised to be there if she needed their help, and for that she was entirely grateful to them. They both were godmothers to Ivy, and Jules still couldn't decide if that was the best or the worst decision she's ever made. They spoiled her at every turn, last week being an example when they bought so many birthday presents for Ivy. It was a good thing they ran the daycare. That was what made it easier for Jules to leave Ivy there, knowing that Andy and Sophie would be there with her munchkin. Sophia was a rebel in her family, at least that's what her parents thought. They wanted her to be a part of the family's fashion empire, but she wanted to find her own path and had ended up at Freddie and Company taking care of kids, which she had grown to love. She had first applied for the job to have an income while looking for another job because her parents had cut her off, but now, she was just like Miranda, who loved kids more than she did people her age. Miranda was from a simple middle-class family like her. She trusted people so easily, which as a result made her lose hope in humanity. She stuck to what she was best at, taking care of kids. She had been in one relationship since they all became friends, and Jules and Sophie knew the relationship was toxic. Miranda just had a hard time letting go after she let someone in. Derek, her boyfriend, was a jerk. She knew it, they all knew it, but Miranda didn't want to let go of him because she was secretly hoping he'd go back to the guy he was when she met him, which in Sophie and Jules' opinion was never going to happen. Jules spotted Andy with the other kids. She looked so happy. Andy, short for Miranda, loved children, but when she and Sophie brought up having some of hers, she freaked out. "Jules," Andy called when she spotted Jules. "Where's the little princess?" "With Sophie," she said, and before Jules could utter another word, Andy left the kids with the other staffs and went out into the lobby where Sophie and Ivy were. Jules shook her head and followed. "Hi, princess." Andy spoke to Ivy like a cartoon character. "It's me, Andy." Ivy smiled and murmured something like candy. Miranda let out a screech. "Close, but you can do better," she said to Ivy. "She's one, Andy, leave her alone," Sophie said to Andy. "You're just jealous she got to say my name first," Andy said. "I'm pretty sure she said candy." Sophie and Andy bickered on. Since Ivy started talking, they had both been trying to get her to say their names. "Okay. I'm gonna leave you guys and I'll see you during lunch break." Jules interrupted them, kissing Ivy on her temple. "Bye, pretty. Mama will see you later." "Mama." Ivy cooed. Jules left Ivy with her friends still bickering, Ivy glancing from one to another and back. She got into the elevator and pushed the number to her floor ready to get to work. Caesar was beginning to get impatient. He hadn't been able to focus since the day he found out he had a daughter. What if she was out there suffering? He hadn't heard from Tom since then and he couldn't help wondering if he had found anything on his daughter. Caesar sighed heavily. "Sir? Mr. Lobos is here to see you." Claire's voice filled Caesar's office. "Let him in," he told her. "Yes, sir," she said. Tom walked into his office a few seconds later. "Tom." Caesar got up when he entered. "Tell me you have something. You've kept me waiting for a week." "Actually, I have everything." He sat down. "Well, all that there is anyway." Caesar sighed a sigh of relief. "Great. Okay. I found out that your late wife gave her up for adoption the same day she gave birth in April, and 2 months after your daughter was born, a Jules Jenna took an interest in her, and 9 months later the adoption was finalized. So, my daughter was adopted by this Jules Jenna this year," Caesar said after he did the math. Tom nodded. "What do you have on her?" he asked. "She graduated summa cum laude from UCLA, 27 years old, works at Freddie and Company, single. Lives alone, parents. That's all I need to know, Tom. Do you have her address?" Caesar said before Tom could give him the full information about her. "Of course," he said and scribbled it down on a piece of paper which Caesar provided for him. "What exactly do you plan on doing, sir?" "I'll go to her house and demand for my child. I'll pay her whatever she needs to cover everything she's done so far," Caesar said bluntly. "I don't think that's a good idea. Ms. Jenna isn't that kind of woman. From what I've dug up, she already has a trust fund for your daughter and she lives a comfortable life. Also, she has full right and custody of the child. Even if you were the child's biological father, it wouldn't matter in court, which is where this case might end up because it was a closed adoption. One thing I know is that your late wife had excluded your name in your child's birth certificate, which was the only reason why you weren't contacted during the adoption." Caesar thought about it for a while. "So, you're saying I should do nothing?" Tom sighed. "I'm saying you should find a right angle that would matter when you take this to court. If you just walk in there and show them a DNA sample and give them a letter from your wife's therapist indicating that she wasn't of sound mind when she signed the birth certificate without your name, you might get visiting rights." Caesar snapped his gaze at Tom. "I don't want visiting rights," he said. "Exactly," Tom said. "So, think this through and find a logical way that would make the court think really hard about the closed adoption." Caesar swallowed. He didn't like the court idea one bit hearing about it from Tom. "How long would that take?" "Months," Tom replied. "We'd have to look for proof, which would take 3 to 4 months seeing as we have nothing to begin with. Then filing a case and... I can't wait that long." He sighed as he racked his brain for his next move. He couldn't come up with one that would take less time. The court thing was even the worse. He wanted his daughter in his arms fast and real fast. He would just have to find a way of getting his daughter his own way, no court or lawyers involved. Aside from the fact that Caesar didn't want to wait that long to have his daughter in his arms, he didn't want the press to get wind of this. Taking this to court would make him a target of the media, and he didn't like that. All that thing about any press being good press was rubbish to him. They would take the story and twist it in so many ways, the next generation would still be trying to figure out which one of the stories was right. He couldn't take that chance, and he didn't want his daughter to be let out in that kind of life at an early age. He had to do this without drawing attention to himself. He needed to do something that wouldn't draw the media's attention. "How old did you say this woman was again?" 27, Tom replied. "And single," he said as a Cheshire smile formed on his lips and grew bigger, just like the plan that just came to be in his head. He was going to get close to this woman, gain her trust. Chapter 1 Part 2. Jules rode the elevator up with Ivy in her arms. The only reason she liked work less was that she had to leave Ivy at the daycare on the 2nd floor of the company's building. She wanted Ivy to be with her all the time but knew it wasn't going to happen. The elevator dinged open and she got out, walking into the lobby of the daycare. "Hey, you." Sophie beamed from behind the desk as she saw Jules approaching her. "Hey. Where's Andy?" Jules asked Sophie, looking around for her other best friend. "With the other kids, inside. I don't know how she never gets tired of their screams," she answered, getting up and going around the desk towards Jules. "Hey, cutie. She smiled down at Ivy and Jules' arm. Jules smiled at the look on Ivy's face. It was the same one that she had when she saw Sophie and Andy. She was looking at Sophie with a stoic look, blinking frequently like one of those episodes of Tom and Jerry where they go blink blink blink. Sophie's expression changed to a she's so adorable look as she reached for Ivy and adjusted her in her arms. Ivy's expression changed in seconds as Sophie began speaking baby language to Ivy, which was nothing but complete gibberish. But if it made Ivy smile, then who was she to stop the discussion? Jules left Ivy with Sophie going inside the daycare in search of Andy. Jules, Miranda and Sophia have been friends since Jules joined Freddie and Company 5 years ago. They had hit it off immediately and have been friends ever since. They knew about the adoption and everything else just like she knew about Sophia's family problems and Miranda's relationship issues. They were the ones who resurfaced her dream of adopting and promised to be there if she needed their help, and for that she was entirely grateful to them. They both were godmothers to Ivy, and Jules still couldn't decide if that was the best or the worst decision she's ever made. They spoiled her at every turn, last week being an example when they bought so many birthday presents for Ivy. It was a good thing they ran the daycare. That was what made it easier for Jules to leave Ivy there, knowing that Andy and Sophie would be there with her munchkin. Sophia was a rebel in her family, at least that's what her parents thought. They wanted her to be a part of the family's fashion empire, but she wanted to find her own path and had ended up at Freddie and Company taking care of kids, which she had grown to love. She had first applied for the job to have an income while looking for another job because her parents had cut her off, but now, she was just like Miranda, who loved kids more than she did people her age. Miranda was from a simple middle-class family like her. She trusted people so easily, which as a result made her lose hope in humanity. She stuck to what she was best at, taking care of kids. She had been in one relationship since they all became friends, and Jules and Sophie knew the relationship was toxic. Miranda just had a hard time letting go after she let someone in. Derek, her boyfriend, was a jerk. She knew it, they all knew it, but Miranda didn't want to let go of him because she was secretly hoping he'd go back to the guy he was when she met him, which in Sophie and Jules' opinion was never going to happen. Jules spotted Andy with the other kids. She looked so happy. Andy, short for Miranda, loved children, but when she and Sophie brought up having some of hers, she freaked out. Jules, Andy called when she spotted Jules. "Where's the little princess?" "With Sophie," she said, and before Jules could utter another word, Andy left the kids with the other staffs and went out into the lobby where Sophie and Ivy were. Jules shook her head and followed. "Hi, princess." Andy spoke to Ivy like a cartoon character. "It's me, Andy." Ivy smiled and murmured something like candy. Miranda let out a screech. "Close, but you can do better," she said to Ivy. "She's one, Andy, leave her alone," Sophie said to Andy. "You're just jealous she got to say my name first," Andy said. "I'm pretty sure she said candy." Sophie and Andy bickered on. Since Ivy started talking, they had both been trying to get her to say their names. "Okay. I'm gonna leave you guys and I'll see you during lunch break." Jules interrupted them, kissing Ivy on her temple. "Bye, pretty. Mama will see you later." "Mama." Ivy cooed. Jules left Ivy with her friends still bickering, Ivy glancing from one to another and back. She got into the elevator and pushed the number to her floor, ready to get to work. Caesar was beginning to get impatient. He hadn't been able to focus since the day he found out he had a daughter. What if she was out there suffering? He hadn't heard from Tom since then, and he couldn't help wondering if he had found anything on his daughter. Caesar sighed heavily. "Sir? Mr. Lobos is here to see you." Claire's voice filled Caesar's office. "Let him in," he told her. "Yes, sir," she said. Tom walked into his office a few seconds later. "Tom." Caesar got up when he entered. "Tell me you have something. You've kept me waiting for a week." "Actually, I have everything." He sat down. "Well, all that there is anyway." Caesar sighed a sigh of relief. "Great. Okay. I found out that your late wife gave her up for adoption the same day she gave birth in April, and 2 months after your daughter was born, a Jules Jenna took an interest in her, and 9 months later the adoption was finalized. "So, my daughter was adopted by this Jules Jenna this year," Caesar said after he did the math. Tom nodded. "What do you have on her?" he asked. "She graduated summa cum laude from UCLA, 27 years old, works at Freddie and Company, single. Lives alone, parents. That's all I need to know, Tom." Do you have her address? Caesar said before Tom could give him the full information about her. Of course, he said and scribbled it down on a piece of paper which Caesar provided for him. What exactly do you plan on doing, sir? I'll go to her house and demand for my child. I'll pay her whatever she needs to cover everything she's done so far. Caesar said bluntly. I don't think that's a good idea. Ms. Jenna isn't that kind of woman. From what I've dug up, she already has a trust fund for your daughter and she lives a comfortable life. Also, she has full right and custody of the child. Even if you were the child's biological father, it wouldn't matter in court, which is where this case might end up because it was a closed adoption. One thing I know is that your late wife had excluded your name in your child's birth certificate, which was the only reason why you weren't contacted during the adoption. Caesar thought about it for a while. So, you're saying I should do nothing? Tom sighed. I'm saying you should find a right angle that would matter when you take this to court. If you just walk in there and show them a DNA sample and give them a letter from your wife's therapist indicating that she wasn't of sound mind when she signed the birth certificate without your name, you might get visiting rights. Caesar snapped his gaze at Tom. I don't want visiting rights, he said. Exactly. Tom said, so, think this through and find a logical way that would make the court think really hard about the closed adoption. Caesar swallowed. He didn't like the court idea one bit hearing about it from Tom. How long would that take? Months. Tom replied we'd have to look for proof, which would take 3 to 4 months seeing as we have nothing to begin with. Then filing a case and... I can't wait that long. He sighed as he racked his brain for his next move. He couldn't come up with one that would take less time. The court thing was even the worse. He wanted his daughter in his arms fast and real fast. He would just have to find a way of getting his daughter his own way, no court or lawyers involved. Aside from the fact that Caesar didn't want to wait that long to have his daughter in his arms, he didn't want the press to get wind of this. Taking this to court would make him a target of the media, and he didn't like that. All that thing about any press being good press was rubbish to him. They would take the story and twist it in so many ways, the next generation would still be trying to figure out which one of the stories was right. He couldn't take that chance, and he didn't want his daughter to be let out in that kind of life at an early age. He had to do this without drawing attention to himself. He needed to do something that wouldn't draw the media's attention. How old did you say this woman was again? 27, Tom replied. And single. He said as a Cheshire smile formed on his lips and grew bigger, just like the plan that just came to be in his head. He was going to get close to this woman, gain her trust, get his child and end everything with her. It would be as easy as that. Caesar thought, smiling. This was going to be fun. Chapter 2. By the end of the day, Caesar's plan was fully formed and he was ready to execute it. He told Claire to cancel all his appointments before he made his way towards the elevator. A minute later the elevator dinged open into the lobby. Caesar stepped out and headed outside. All heads turned as he walked by. It had always been like that for Caesar. He was an epitome of perfection and the ladies couldn't keep their eyes off of him. A man who has been the cover of the top business magazine, All Business Central, for 3 consecutive years. Had been labeled sexy, hot bachelor among other things. He was already used to the attention since the last issue of the magazine. Have a nice day, Sir Clarence, the doorman said as he opened the door for him. Caesar gave him a curt nod as he exited the building, spotting Patrick in the car waiting for him in front of the building. Claire knew to call Patrick to get the car ready every time he left the office. She didn't need to be told again. Patrick held the door open and closed it after he got in. Where to, sir? Patrick asked after he got in and started the car. Freddie and Company, Caesar replied. Caesar arrived at Freddie & Co. a few minutes later. He got out of the car and made his way into the building and towards the elevator. As he entered, the receptionist couldn't utter a word, she just gaped at him. He pushed the button to the elevator and waited for it. Oh, how he hated waiting. It didn't take long for the elevator to arrive and Caesar stepped aside as people exited the elevator. The last person stepped out gawking at him like the rest of the female population before she walked past him. Caesar ignored her and moved to enter the elevator. He stared down at his phone just at the same time another person stepped out. Their shoulders bumped, which made a bag fall to the ground. Caesar was already on the edge of losing it because of the weight, and this person couldn't watch where they were going, and it angered him. He was about giving her a piece of his mind when the woman bent to pick her purse, and then the sleeping child in her arms caught his attention. She had brown hair just like the woman carrying her, in different shades. She looked so adorable. He was not a kid's person, but something about this child right here just made him melt at the sight of her. He bent to help the woman gather her things, and when she looked at him, he froze. Jules smiled at him when they got her things. "Thank you." "You're welcome," he said as they both rose from the ground. Coffee brown eyes. Hair in a simple bun. Work clothes that were sexy yet professional. Caesar never thought he'd ever be attracted to a woman who was plain and simple, but something about her sparked an interest in him. He was about to introduce himself when she gave him a final smile and walked away. He stood there watching her as she stepped out of the company building. He considered going after her, but the elevator was closing and he had to get in quick. He got into the elevator before it closed shut. Still thinking about her, the woman he had bumped into, he made it to the top floor and walked into the lobby, spotting Freddie Danford's assistant. She was pretty, but so were many others. She saw him approaching and quickly got up, her eyes went wide. Mr. Thompson. She stuttered. The Thompsons never had any business dealings with Freddie and company, so he never had a reason to contact him. But now he wanted to make a proposal which Danford had to accept. "Mr. Danford here?" Caesar asked her. "Yes, sir," she answered, regaining her composure. "I'll inform him of your presence." Caesar waited, again. "Sir, Mr. Thompson is here to see you," the assistant said into the intercom on her desk. "Mr. Thompson?" Danford sounded surprised. Why wouldn't he? Caesar couldn't blame him. Let him in," he said. "Yes, sir." She smiled seductively at Caesar. "He'll see you now." Caesar ignored her, making a mental note to get rid of her when he got the company, as he walked straight into Freddie Danford's office, shutting the door behind him. "Mr. Thompson." Danford stood. "What a surprise." Caesar walked towards his desk. "Definitely is." "Please, have a seat," he said. Caesar sat down. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" Danford asked. "I'm here for business," he answered. Danford looked confused. "I don't see how we can help you with that, Mr. Thompson. We're not in the same line of work." "I know. But still, I have a proposal for you," Caesar told him. He clenched his jaw. "Let's hear it," he said. "I know Freddie and company has gone bankrupt, and you need people to invest to help you out. I'd like to invest, but I'd love it more if you're looking for a buyer." Caesar paused. "So, name your price." "I'm lost." Danford leaned forward, resting his elbow on the table. "You're saying you want to buy my company?" "That's right." Caesar also leaned forward. "Why would you suddenly want to divert to my line of work? You own construction companies around the world and you want to buy my publishing company. Can I ask why?" "Personal reasons," Caesar answered. "So, numbers?" Danford sighed. "I don't think I'm ready to sell, Mr. Thompson. You need investors to save your company, Mr. Danford, and everyone in the business world knows your company has gone bankrupt. I'm pretty sure I saw no one lining up outside your office, and you don't want to sell?" "It's not my call." "Of course, it is. The members of your board would definitely be on board with the idea, and you'll have to pay back your previous investors." Caesar paused. "Mr. Danford, I'm willing to buy this company and pay your investors back and any other person you owe. Just name your price." Danford looked shocked and happy. He smiled. "We have a deal, Mr. Thompson." He stood up and stretched his hand. Caesar got up, buttoned his suit jacket before reaching for Danford's hand. He smiled at him and nodded. "I'll have my lawyer draw up a contract and have it delivered to you. I want to end this as quickly as possible." He sighed. "Your reason must be very important." "It is," Caesar said and walked out. On his way out, Caesar called his lawyer and told him to draw up the contract and have it delivered to Mr. Danford today. He wanted to end all tides by tomorrow. The week had gone by in a blur for Jules. It was fun because of lunchtime, but everything else was the same. Everyone at the company knew they had a new CEO, even though they weren't informed. But the news spread like wildfire, and it was only confirmed when Freddie Danford's assistant, Violetta, was fired and Freddie Danford himself no longer came to work. Jules walked into the company building with Ivy in her arms. She made her way towards the elevator and saw it close. "Hold it, please." She yelled and hoped whoever was inside would oblige, and she sent a quiet thank you above when it opened up. "Thank you." She smiled as she stepped inside. Caesar had been going out of his mind trying to find the right approach to the woman that had his daughter, and with overtaking Freddie and co., it hadn't been easy. He had also had his mind on the woman he had seen his first time in the company. He had thought about her, and he was surprised when she stepped into the elevator. No dropping bags? He couldn't help asking. Excuse me? Jules looked at him. Last time we met, you dropped your bag. He said. It took Jules a few seconds to remember, and she smiled. It was you. Caesar couldn't help smiling, which took him by surprise because he hadn't smiled since forever. He couldn't remember the last time someone made him smile. Your daughter is beautiful, he said sincerely. Thank you. Jules didn't know why she felt weird talking to this stranger in an elevator. She did remember him from a few days ago, and she remembered thinking he was good-looking. But she hadn't talked to a man in a while, much less one that looked like he just walked out of a magazine. Santos was the head of her department, so he didn't count. Caesar expected her to slip a sexy comment like all other women did after he gave them a compliment, but Jules didn't. Didn't she know who he was? He was about to introduce himself when the elevator opened to the second floor, the daycare. He had taken the time to know what each floor of the company held. Have a good day, Jules said as she exited the elevator, and he just stared at her, wondering what it was about her that got to him. Jules made her way to her office after she dropped Ivy off. She couldn't help thinking about him. She hadn't seen him around before. Was he new? Morning, Alice. Jules greeted her assistant on her way to her office. Morning, Jules. Alice greeted back. Jules stopped at Alice's door. How many? 4. Jules sighed. Santos was out to get her fired. The day ended not as early as Jules had thought it would. She thought the 4 files Santos had sent to be reviewed would be easily done within office hours. But she was wrong. The files had been bigger than expected, and it was days like these that she was more grateful for Sophie and Andy. She had informed them of her workload, and since they both knew her work principle, they knew they were on Ivy duty, which they loved. Jules made her way to the ground floor late that evening and was informed by Jerry that her car wouldn't start, so she went to the garage to start the darn car, but as Jerry had said, it wouldn't start. After trying a few more times, she gave up and took out her phone and called for an Uber, but there were none available at the moment. Darn it. She thought of who to call, but she knew they would have to come to get her in a taxi if they found one at this time, that is. Besides, she was heading to their apartment. It would be silly for one of them to come to get her in a taxi only to return. She finally gave up, took her bag and stepped out of the car. She was on her way out of the parking lot just at the same time Caesar was driving out for the day. Caesar was beat. He had been swamped all day with handling his current and his previous company. On his way out of the parking lot, he spotted her walking out of the parking lot ahead of him. He pulled up next to her and honked, making her jump. Her heart rate went up a notch. Caesar rolled the glass down, and Jules froze when she saw him behind the wheels of the very expensive car. She knew nothing about cars, but she could tell this one was very expensive. Swallowing inaudibly at the sight of him again. He was so... Need a ride? Caesar interrupted her train of thought, and she felt his voice deep in the pit of her stomach. How could anyone be so hot? Her heart did a double take. Jules looked at him, then really looked. The 2 times they accidentally met, she hadn't taken the time to see what he looked like because it wasn't even on her mind to do so, and her sudden reaction to him now took her by surprise. Who the heck is never sure to get into a car with him? Caesar frowned. What was her deal? No, thank you. I'll wait for a cab. I doubt you'll get one at this time. Why was he pushing her? He thought he could just speed off and never look back. He was asking for trouble, and he was going to get it. Jules was never one to get into just anyone's car, but she did know who he was, kind of. I don't want to trouble you. You're not. Caesar said, I'm offering. Jules smiled. He was, wasn't he? You don't even know where I'm headed. Caesar smiled, then pushed open the passenger's door. Then hop on in and tell me. Jules looked at the open car door. I promise to be a gentleman. He smiled, and Jules couldn't help returning it as she got into his car. Here she goes. Caesar drove with Jules next to him, and he glanced at her. Aren't you forgetting something? Jules glanced at him. What? Your daughter. Jules scoffed. Are you implying that I'm a careless mum? No. No, I wasn't. Damn. He was going for a joke. How long have you worked for Freddie Danford? 5 years? Jules answered, I'm guessing you just joined the company. Caesar nodded. Something like that. How do you like it? She asked. Asked me that after my first month. Jules smiled at what that implied. What makes you think we'll be seeing more of each other? It's a small company. I can easily track you down. Caesar hadn't stopped glancing at her as she spoke. Now I know where your daughter got her beauty from. Jules looked at him, quizzically. You. Jules laughed. I highly doubt that. Why's that? He asked. Jules just smiled and looked away. But you are beautiful. He said, you must have men lining up. Jules sighed inaudibly. Even if that were true, she wouldn't still go for anyone. Chapter 3. Just let me out there. She pointed in front of Miranda's apartment. Caesar pulled up directly in front of Miranda's apartment. Wait. He told Jules before he got out of the car and before Jules could ask why he was opening her door. Jules smiled as she stepped out. Thank you. Caesar smiled. So, see you around? Maybe. Goodness, she was flirting with him. She couldn't remember the last time she flirted. Good night and thanks again. Anytime. Caesar watched Jules as she made her way towards the apartment and climbed up the stairs. He rounded the car, got in and drove off. Jules finally reached Miranda's door, then knocked once and waited. No one answered, so she knocked again. I'm coming. She heard someone yell from inside. The door finally opened and she saw Sophie. Oh my goodness, Jules, where have you been? You were supposed to be here minutes ago, she said. Andy almost called the cops. What? Jules laughed at her friend's humor as she stepped into the cozy apartment. Andy, Jules is here, Sophie yelled after she shut the door. Andy came from one of the bedrooms into the medium-sized sitting room with Ivy. Where have you been? I almost called the cops. I'm sorry. My car didn't start and there wasn't any available Uber. But I got a ride. Jules said as she took Ivy in her arms and kissed the top of her head. Sophie went to the kitchen while Jules and Andy moved to the living room. Andy took the other seat next to her. A ride? Sophie asked from the kitchen as she stirred. With whom? Jules realized at that moment that she didn't know who he was and they had met 3 times. I don't know his name. She shook her head, brows furrowed. Oh, my goodness, didn't anyone ever tell you not to accept rides from strangers, and a male stranger at that? Andy said, was he hot though? Jules laughed. First of all, he wasn't a stranger, not really. She said, secondly, yes, he was hot. And that was how their girls' night started. Caesar couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something about her that attracted him to her. She was different from anyone he'd dated, before B, and anyone he slept with, after B. She was mesmerizing and he hadn't been able to stop himself from glancing at her. One look hadn't been enough. He remembered her baby then and he smiled at the irony of his situation. He was admiring someone else's daughter when he never liked kids. Okay, maybe that was a little bit too extreme, but from what he had seen and heard about them, they were loud and messy, 2 things he hated, noise and mess. He'd never thought of having his own kids, but B's letter had changed that. He wanted to be a father. He wanted to be called dad by his daughter, and he didn't just want the title, he wanted everything that came with the title. A smile tugged at his lips as he pictured a little version of B and himself running around in his living room calling him dad and giggling as he chased her. His smile faded as it occurred to him that he still didn't know her name. They had met 3 times and he hadn't gotten her name. He would definitely be seeing her soon. He thought, and a smile tugged at his lips as he pulled up into his garage. The next morning, Jules woke up and got ready to leave after making breakfast for everyone. Ivy woke up later and Jules fed her, got her ready for the day, for whatever they were going to do. Andy woke up before she left and decided she and Sophie were going to take Ivy out. So, she had to leave Ivy with them and go home alone. They were going to bring her home in the evening, which meant she had the day to herself. Jules was cleaning late that afternoon when she heard a knock on the door. She went to check who it was and was very surprised at who she found standing on the other side of her door. You? She said when she opened the door. Caesar looked up from the floor and stared at the familiar face. His heart stopped beating as shock spread through his entire body. His breath caught. He had woken up this morning with a smile on his face and he had no idea why. He decided to check out the address Tom found of his daughter's adoptive mother, Jules Jenna. He wasted no time at all, and after he got some work done for his new company, he left the house and went in search of Jules Jenna. Thanks to the GPS, it didn't take much time to find the house. Now here he was staring at her and all he could think was, this isn't happening. He released the breath he had been holding, still too shocked to speak. What are you doing here? She smiled. What are you doing here? He asked, hoping this was some kind of mistake. He could remember clearly, he didn't drop her here yesterday. So, what was she doing here, he wondered. I live here, she said as a matter of fact. Caesar was confused. The owner of the house? He asked. If she owned the house then. I own the house, she said. Now at least, she murmured. Who owned it previously? He asked, praying silently that she would give him a name he was already becoming familiar with and he'd be on his way in search of her, hopefully with a new address to go. She still then just stared at him. She shook her head and blinked fast. Then she looked back at him. I'm sorry for my bad manners. Do you want to come in? She smiled at him. The change in her expression was so fast that he felt like he stumbled in. Sure, he said, stepping in as she opened the door wide. Caesar entered and waited for her to shut the door behind them. Then she led him into the living room through the short narrow hallway. They entered the living room and Caesar saw some toys at the corner and a duster on the table. She was cleaning. I'm sorry about the mess, she said as she picked the duster and took it to the kitchen, which was open to the living room. Have a seat, please. Caesar sat and waited for her to join him. Can I get you anything? She asked from the kitchen. Water is fine, he said, really needing to cool down. He watched her movement in the kitchen and then she joined him with a cup of clear water and a tray which she offered to him. Thank you. He picked the glass from the tray and took a sip. Jules placed the tray on the table and took the seat next to his as Caesar placed the glass on the table and then turned to her. I want to thank you for yesterday. I would have gotten there late or not at all. She spoke before he could get out a word. Don't mention. His gaze on her the entire time as he tried to digest that the woman he may or may not have a thing for might be his daughter's adoptive mum. His head was in a mess and he was trying to focus on what she was saying than the situation he was in. I'm sorry I didn't get to introduce myself yesterday, she said. Caesar didn't have the chance to reply before she continued. I'm Jules Jenna. Caesar stilled as her name confirmed his suspicion. He took in the fact that she was who he was looking for, which was exactly what he was afraid of. That she'd end up being the one. The one he had already labeled a baby stealer in his head. The one whom all he wanted from was to get close to, gain her trust, then take his child slowly away from right under her nose. But now, could he do that? When he had seen the way she was with her child, his child. Are you okay? Jules asked when his expression had gone sour. Yay, I just realized I have to be somewhere. He stood up. I apologize for showing up unannounced. Jules got up slowly. It's all right, she said. At least I got a chance to thank you for last night, again. She led him towards the door. Jules opened the door for him and waited as he stepped out. She stood and watched Caesar walk down the stairs, rounding his car and opening the door. But before he got in, he looked at her. I'm Caesar, by the way, Caesar said. Caesar Tom. He couldn't give away his full identity now. He thought the mother of his daughter would already know who he was through the media, but she didn't. He could use that to his advantage. If she knew who he was, she was likely to either fall to his feet or not give him the time of the day. And from the little taste of what he had gotten from her the previous night, he was sure it would be the latter. It was hard to believe a woman like her still existed in the world, women who didn't care about money and status as most of them did. She was different, she was good, kind and uninterested in wealth or status, and if she found out who he was, she was likely to turn her back on him and walk away. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. Caesar Thomas, he said with a smile. She gave him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and nodded. It's nice meeting you. Same, Caesar said before he got into his car and drove off, his mind going ballistic. Jules' gaze followed his car till it was out of sight. Caesar Thomas, Jules thought. She knew his name now, but how did he find her? She entered the house and shut the door behind her. Sighing, she leaned her back against the door and placed her hand on her beating heart. How in the world was he able to do this to her steady heart? Boy, was he gorgeous? He was, flawless. She'd never been this way just by being around a guy before. But something about this one made her heart race so fast and furious. Goodness, she sounded like a schoolgirl ranting on about her crush of the week. She walked back into the kitchen grabbing the duster. She headed into the living room to continue her cleaning, trying to keep the Caesar Thomas out of her head when the man in question couldn't keep her out of his head. It felt wrong. Caesar thought. Everything did. He was unsure of himself now. Before he had put a picture to the name Jules Jenna, he had imagined what Jules Jenna looked like and more importantly, what she was like with his daughter. Then he had met a woman at the beginning of the week and twice during. The way she was with that child showed how caring she was and her love for her child. To him, those were two different women. But now he knows those women are one and the same. The woman was Jules Jenna. Jules Jenna was the one he thought of as caring and loving. Jules Jenna wasn't anything he had imagined her to be. She was beautiful, humble, she sparked something in him and most importantly, she genuinely loved his child. Caesar sighed. What exactly was he supposed to do now that he knew she was the woman with his child, the woman whose life he intended on wrecking? Caesar was so confused when he pulled his car into his driveway and got out. He slammed the door and made his way inside the apartment straight through the living room, up the stairs, down the hall and into his room. He plopped down on his bed lying on his back, eyes fixated on the ceiling. He sighed heavily. Chapter 4. It had been a few days since Caesar left Jules' house looking all hot and dashing. Work was still the same for her, interesting, fun, other times boring. The new CEO, whose identity was still unknown to her, had made a few changes by firing most of the employees and hiring new ones. She was glad he had kept the staff in the children's section though. She was already familiar with all of them aside from Andy and Sophie, and she was glad Ivy and the other kids wouldn't have to deal with new faces. She heard he was planning on changing the name of the company, which didn't come as a surprise. The name, she didn't mind, but him firing and replacing most of the workers wasn't fair. That was just cold-hearted. She got that he was doing his job, but he should have given them a month's notice or at least a week. He just upped and fired them, hopefully. He included severance pay. She had heard a lot of things about him from the gossip of the office, but no one had gotten a glimpse of him yet. Jules was in the kitchen cooking when she heard a knock at the door. Who could it be? She wondered as she abandoned what she was doing and went to get the door. Jules pulled the door open and her breath caught when she saw who it was. Oh darn. Jules thought as her eyes betrayed her and went checking him out. He looked flawless in his black suit, a white shirt which had a few buttons undone. Not a single strand of his hair was out of place. In short, he looked immaculate. Her eyes met his and she saw a hint of a smile on his face. That's when she realized she had been staring. Are you done ogling me, Miss Jenna? Caesar asked in his husky and very sexy voice that made her swallow. Caesar had stayed away from her for the past couple of days trying to set his mind and get his thoughts straight. It wasn't an easy task. He had a hard time letting go of the woman he offered a ride at the office's garage that night. But he had to see Jules Jenna for who she really was and remember that she is the woman who had his daughter. He decided to set his plan in motion and knew she wouldn't give his daughter up. So, he was going to wine and dine her. He'd make her fall madly in love with him. Jules Jenna was one of those hard-to-get types, but she couldn't remain immune to his charms forever. Sooner or later she'd crack, and he preferred sooner rather than later because only then could he move forward with the rest of his plan. He would get married to her and adopt his daughter. Finally, he would let his lawyer, who was the best, work his magic in court, and he would have full custody of his daughter then, and only then would he divorce her. Aya was not. Jules' stutter snapped Caesar out of his thoughts of his well-laid devious plan. May I come in? He asked, interrupting her. What was he doing here, again? Jules wondered. Of course, she said, opening the door wider. He stepped in and walked towards the living room, but not before he made sure his arm brushed hers, and he lingered close for a while before he proceeded into the living room. Jules sighed and closed the door, joining him in the living room. Caesar was scanning the room when Jules got there. He took in the surroundings, something he hadn't thoroughly done the last time he was here. His gaze traveled to the kitchen, and that made Jules remember the food she had left on the stove. Oh shoot. She ran into the kitchen and turned the gas off. She sighed in relief when she checked to find she hadn't burned her meal. She would have gone to bed without having dinner because she was beat to prepare another one for herself. Everything okay? Jules jumped at the nearness of his voice. She looked behind to find him watching her. Darn. He made her kitchen seem smaller than it already was. Yay. She said, all good. She had felt the power and confidence oozing out of him the 2 times they had met, but now, in her tiny kitchen, it was almost drowning. Wait. What the heck was wrong with her and her thoughts these days? Jules snapped herself out of whatever haze this Greek god had put her under. I'm sorry about that, she said, walking past him out of the kitchen and into the living room, all along aware of his gaze on her as he followed suit. Caesar didn't say anything, just looked at her while they both sat on different sofas. So why? I'm here to apologize for the way I stormed out of here the other day, Caesar said, interrupting her. Oh, that? It's nothing. It's fine. I'm sure you had. I remembered something really important I had to take care of, he said, interrupting her once again. It's really okay. I mean, I wasn't. I know, he was about saying before she cut him off. You do know you haven't let me complete a sentence, Jules pointed out, getting irritated with his interruptions. He looked taken aback. Excuse me? You haven't let me complete a sentence since you walked through the doors. Jules smiled. I don't know if you're telepathic or just arrogant that way, Jules said instead. There was something different about him, Jules thought. He had a hint of a smile playing on his lips. I'm sorry. Caesar frowned as he apologized to the woman for the second time that day, something he never did. Is your meal edible enough? What? Jules was confused as he changed the topic. The food, it was on when I walked in. He stated, is it edible or did it get burned? Oh. No, it's edible. That's a shame. I'd have loved to take you out for dinner. Jules felt the blush creep from her neck to her cheeks, but she pushed away the excitement that bubbled up to the surface at his indirect offer. You do remember that I have a daughter, right? As if on cue, Ivy's cry echoed through the house. Excuse me. Jules got up and ran down to the spare room she used for Ivy when she was busy in the kitchen. She pushed the door open and the minute Ivy saw her, she quieted down. Mama, she said, raising her hands for Jules to pick her up. Hey, princess. Jules smiled as she picked up a pouting Ivy. Hungry? Hungry, she said. Jules smiled down at her. Adjusting Ivy on her hip, she went back to the living room where she had left her uninvited guest. I don't think you've officially met my daughter, Jules said as she entered the living room. Caesar got up and turned when he heard Jules. His face went blank when his gaze fell from Jules and landed on Ivy. Those 2 times he had admired her, he never knew she was his flesh and blood. But now that he knew, he felt his heart expand and fill with love. Love for his little girl whom he couldn't wait for to be his completely. If he hadn't given her up, he wouldn't have to go through this. He would have been with his daughter and been the happiest man. Jules saw a look pass in Caesar's eyes and couldn't quite place it. It was almost sad to watch the feeling play in his eyes as he looked at Ivy. Ivy always made people who met her smile, but it made this man sad. Jules frowned at that. Jules approached him with a smile plastered on her face as she looked from Caesar to Ivy to see her reaction to a new face. This is Ivy? Jules said. Caesar's thin lips curved into a smile and soon it grew wider into a grin. The dimple on his cheek didn't do anything to calm her erratic heart. Ivy. He loved the name Jules had given her. That's a beautiful name. Ivy snapped her gaze from his sexy dimple to meet his gaze when he said Ivy's name. The bundle of joy in Jules' arms beamed up at him before she reached out to him. Dada. Jules froze and her gaze met Caesar's surprised ones. Caesar was surprised at Ivy's outburst, but he almost couldn't contain the joy that exploded in his heart. He never thought he'd hear that word anytime soon, but he wasn't complaining. Just that word made his day, his life. Ivy, no. Not Dada. Jules tried to tell Ivy I'm sorry. She's never called anyone that before. She must have picked it up from the kids at the daycare or at the park. Jules said to Caesar. It's all right. May I? He asked Jules for permission to carry her. Jules was surprised that a man like him would want to carry a child. Of course. Hey, beautiful, Caesar said as he picked Ivy from Jules' arms. Ivy went willingly. How are you? Caesar asked, hoping she could understand him. Dada. she said again, poking his face, then giggling lightly, which made him smile a full toothy smile. Caesar sat down carefully as Ivy just stared into his eyes like she was accessing him piece by piece. Then she launched up at him, going for his hair, but didn't make it. He watched in fascination as she pulled at his tie, trying to reach for his hair. When she finally made it, her tiny hands found their way to his hair and she began tugging and yanking, but he didn't mind. Jules watched as Ivy played with Caesar's hair. It was fascinating how Ivy could make him seem relaxed and happy. She expected Caesar to run the other direction when she brought Ivy out, but he had picked her up and was letting her near his perfect hair. What was it about this man? Jules thought. His presence screamed power and strong will, yet he seemed to have none of those with Ivy. Then she remembered what had made Ivy wake up in the first place. Thank goodness she had made her food before she got started on hers. Somehow, she felt it was safe to keep Ivy with Caesar. So far, he'd been a gentleman and he didn't seem like the type of man that would harm a child or anyone for that matter. Intentionally. She added as she thought of all those women who might have been hurt by him without him having done anything to or with them. Besides, he worked in the same company as hers and she knew for a fact they ran a background check before hiring anyone. Is it fine if she stays with you for a while? I need to warm up her food. Jules asked, and Caesar looked up at her. He had totally forgotten she was in the room. Yeah, he said, not wanting to sound too happy about being left alone with his daughter. With Ivy. He wanted to scream, "She's my daughter." He looked at Jules, who was still watching him closely. He knew she was contemplating leaving Ivy with him, a stranger, only if he knew. She'll be fine, he promised. Jules sighed, nodding her head before she left for the kitchen. Ivy played with everything on Caesar that caught her attention till Jules walked back into the living room minutes later with a bowl of whole grain cereal in her hand. She sat on the same sofa Caesar sat with Ivy, keeping some distance between them. The distance didn't stop Caesar from being able to inhale her scent, and it almost drove him into a frenzy. She smelled of vanilla. "Come on, Ivy," Jules said to Ivy, who crawled out of Caesar's lap and into Jules. Jules adjusted Ivy so she was facing him. She picked the bowl up and took a spoonful of the cereal and brought it near Ivy's mouth. Ivy opened up, and once the cereal was in her mouth, she chewed on it, even though there was nothing to chew on, before she swallowed. Caesar's heart clenched as he watched them. Jules would sometimes have to say "ah" before Ivy opened up her mouth. Caesar was too caught up at the sight before he didn't realize he was smiling like a complete idiot. "Ivy, open up, few more spoons," Jules told Ivy as she placed the spoon near Ivy's mouth. Ivy shook her head, then her gaze locked with his and a smile spread across her face. Caesar smiled back at her before she looked away and focused her gaze on Jules. "Mama," she called. Caesar's breath caught at that. As much as he hated and wanted to deny it, Ivy saw Jules as her mother, and there was nothing he could do about it for now. Ivy placed a hand on Jules' face, then she pointed at Caesar. "Dada." Jules looked at Caesar. The look of surprise she had before was non-existent. He knew she didn't approve of it, but how could she explain to a 1-year-old that the person she calls Dada isn't her dad? Only if she knew the truth behind Ivy's words. "No, Ivy." Jules shook her head at Ivy. "Caesar, not Dada." She tried to explain again, but it was a lost cause because Ivy wouldn't have it. "Dada," Ivy said again, adamantly, which made Caesar smile. She was definitely his daughter, not that he had any doubt. "You want him to feed you?" Jules asked, guessing what Ivy was trying to say. Ivy pointed at Caesar and Jules sighed, looking at Caesar. "Do you mind? She won't finish this unless you feed her," Jules said as Ivy crawled out of her lap and into Caesar's. Jules didn't like this one bit, and Caesar could tell, but he didn't say anything. Ivy was usually Switzerland with Andy, Sophie and some of the staff at the daycare, but never with someone she was meeting for the first time. Caesar wanted to ignore the worry on Jules' face and feed Ivy, but he had to get her to be comfortable with him handling Ivy before he proceeded with his plan. But darn it, he wasn't going to keep this up for so long. He wanted to be able to do anything that made his daughter happy without seeking approval or assuring someone it was fine. "It's fine," Caesar said. She nodded and handed the bowl over to him. Caesar began to feed Ivy just as he had seen Jules do. Ivy opened up every single time till she finished the cereal. "Good girl." Caesar praised Ivy after her last spoon, and she beamed up at him. Jules couldn't stop the smile that crept to her face, so she took the bowl and went back to the kitchen and placed it in the sink. She was back and was quiet as she watched Ivy play with Caesar. Jules had no idea how much time passed as she watched the two of them and made light conversation with Caesar. She noticed later as Ivy began to doze off. "That's my cue." Jules got up and to pick a sleeping Ivy from Caesar. Caesar stopped her, but it didn't look like Jules was going to budge. Then he said, "Let me." Jules looked at him like she was trying to figure him out, but she knew she wasn't going to get anything just by looking at him.